In October of 1994, a Kurdish shepherd named Şavak Yıldız was walking across the arid, sun-scorched hills of southeastern Turkey, guiding his flock through the ancient landscape that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the birth and death of religions, and the countless footsteps of humanity stretching back through millennia into the mists of time itself. When his foot struck something that would shatter every assumption modern archaeology had carefully constructed about the origins of human civilization. The stone he kicked, protruding from the earth like a bone emerging from flesh, was not a natural formation weathered by wind and time, but rather a deliberately carved pillar that had been waiting beneath the soil for nearly 12,000 years, holding secrets that would force scientists to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth. Everything we thought we knew about our ancestors, about the progression of human society from primitive cave dwellers to sophisticated builders, was not just incomplete, but fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. When Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist who would dedicate the rest of his life to excavating this impossible site, first arrived at Göbekli Tepe, which translates hauntingly as Potbelly Hill, he recognized immediately that he was standing at the edge of something that transcended normal archaeological discovery, something that reached back into a period of human history that was supposed to be characterized by small bands of nomadic hunters struggling for survival, not by organized labor forces capable of quarrying, transporting, and erecting megalithic structures that would dwarf the capabilities of societies that wouldn't emerge for another 6,000 years. The massive T-shaped pillars that Schmidt's team would eventually uncover, some towering over 15 feet tall and weighing more than 20 tons, were not crude monuments hastily assembled by desperate people seeking shelter from the elements, but rather were magnificent works of art, adorned with intricate bas-reliefs depicting animals that prowled through Neolithic imaginations. Scorpions with their tails curved in eternal threat. Vultures spreading wings that seemed to encompass the very sky. Foxes frozen mid-prowl. Serpents coiling with ancient menace. And creatures whose symbolic meanings have been lost to the vast gulf of time that separates their creators from our modern attempts at understanding. To grasp the sheer impossibility of Göbekli Tepe's existence, we must perform a thought experiment that translates ancient chronology into modern absurdity. Imagine discovering tomorrow that a perfectly functioning Hyperloop transportation system had been built in medieval England, or that Renaissance artisans had constructed a particle accelerator beneath the Vatican, or that Bronze Age civilizations had launched satellites into orbit that we're only now detecting with our most sophisticated telescopes. The cognitive dissonance, the intellectual vertigo that such discoveries would provoke, barely approaches the gen shock that Göbekli Tepe delivered to the archaeological establishment. Because this site predates Stonehenge by approximately 7,000 years, rises from the earth over 6,000 years before the Great Pyramid of Giza would cast its first shadow across Egyptian sand, and was already ancient beyond reckoning when the Sumerians, long considered the earliest civilization, first pressed cuneiform into wet clay. The people who built Göbekli Tepe lived in a world where agriculture hadn't been invented yet, where the wheel existed only as a distant dream in the evolutionary future, where metalworking was still thousands of years from discovery, and where human beings were supposed to be living in small, disorganized groups focused entirely on the immediate necessities of finding food, avoiding predators, and surviving through harsh winters that could extinguish entire communities in a single season. Every textbook that has ever been written about the progression of human civilization follows a neat, logical sequence that archaeologists defended with the fervor of religious dogma, before Göbekli Tepe emerged to challenge their certainties. First, our ancestors developed increasingly sophisticated tools, gradually improving their ability to hunt and gather. Then, over thousands of years, they discovered agriculture and began cultivating crops, which allowed them to abandon their nomadic lifestyle. Next, permanent settlements emerged as people clustered around their fields, leading to the development of villages and eventually cities. Only after establishing these settled communities did they have the surplus time and resources to develop religious practices and construct monuments to their gods. And finally, with all these elements in place, they could achieve what we recognize as civilization. But Göbekli Tepe, rising from the earth like a middle finger extended toward this comfortable narrative, reverses this entire sequence with archaeological evidence so overwhelming that even the most traditional scholars cannot dismiss it. Here stands a massive religious complex, requiring coordinated labor from hundreds or perhaps thousands of workers. Built by people who had no permanent settlements, no agriculture, no domesticated animals, no pottery, no writing, and none of the other markers we associate with the organizational capacity necessary for such monumental construction. The engineering challenges alone should have been impossible for these supposedly primitive people to overcome. Yet, overcome them they did. With a sophistication that continues to puzzle researchers who have spent decades studying how modern construction achieves similar feats with the benefit of steel cables, hydraulic cranes, computer-aided design, and diesel-powered machinery. Moving a single 20-ton pillar from the quarry to its final position would require not just dozens of workers pulling in coordinated effort, but also advanced understanding of leverage, friction, weight distribution, and the kind of project management that we typically associate with modern construction firms managing billion-dollar infrastructure projects. The quarrying itself demonstrates knowledge of stone properties that would allow workers to extract massive blocks without causing fractures that would render them useless, while the carving of intricate animal reliefs into limestone surfaces reveals artistic skill and symbolic thinking of a complexity that shouldn't exist in a society we've always imagined as barely scraping by at the edge of survival. Comparing this achievement to our modern world requires imagining a contemporary society attempting to build Dubai's Burj Khalifa, currently the world's tallest building, requiring thousands of workers, millions of tons of materials, and billions of dollars in investment, using only wooden tools, human muscle power, and no written plans, no computer models, no cranes, no concrete, no steel, and none of the accumulated engineering knowledge that makes such structures possible today. Yet, perhaps the most disturbing mystery of Göbekli Tepe isn't its impossible existence or its sophisticated construction, but rather what happened to it roughly 1,200 years after its creation, when the people who had maintained and expanded this site across dozens of generations made a decision that defies all logic and challenges every assumption about how human societies treat their most sacred spaces. Around 8000 BCE, in an act that seems utterly incomprehensible to modern minds accustomed to preservation and restoration of ancient monuments, the inhabitants of Göbekli Tepe deliberately buried the entire complex under thousands of tons of earth, carefully filling in the spaces between pillars with soil and debris, effectively creating a time capsule that would preserve the site with remarkable precision through the subsequent millennia. This wasn't gradual abandonment, allowing nature to slowly reclaim the structures, nor was it destruction by enemies seeking to obliterate the religious symbols of conquered peoples, but rather was an intentional, painstaking burial that would have required as much labor as the original construction, demanding that we ask ourselves what could possibly motivate a society to invest enormous effort in hiding rather than preserving their greatest architectural achievement. Imagine, if you can, a scenario in the modern world that parallels this inexplicable act. Visualize humanity in the year 2025, making a collective decision to bury the internet's infrastructure, dismantling server farms and burying them under millions of tons of earth, to hide the Hubble Space Telescope by launching it into the sun, to fill the Large Hadron Collider with concrete and erase all records of its existence, to deliberately destroy and conceal every technological achievement of the past century so thoroughly that future archaeologists would struggle to prove we ever possessed such capabilities. The comparison seems absurd, perhaps even insane. Yet this is precisely what the builders of Göbekli Tepe chose to do with their most significant structure. And we're left to wonder what knowledge they possessed, what experiences they had survived, what fears haunted their collective consciousness with such intensity that preserving their temple for future generations seemed less important than ensuring it remained hidden beneath the earth. The precision of this burial suggests reverence rather than rejection, preservation rather than destruction, and the possibility that whoever ordered this massive undertaking understood that they were creating a message for future humans, encoding information in stone that would outlast any written language, any oral tradition, any fragile medium that the ages could erode into nothing. Standing today among the excavated pillars of Göbekli Tepe, watching the same sun that witnessed the site's construction cast shadows across stone, carved by hands that turned to dust millennia before the pharaohs ruled Egypt, we're confronted with questions that archaeology alone cannot answer, and that challenge the fundamental narratives we've constructed about human progress and the nature of civilization itself. What if Göbekli Tepe wasn't simply a temple built by unusually ambitious hunter-gatherers, but rather was something far more purposeful, more urgent, more laden with meaning than our modern categories of religious site or ceremonial center can adequately capture? What if those pillars, standing like silent sentinels, carved with symbols whose full meanings remain tantalizingly beyond our comprehension, were never meant to be monuments celebrating human achievement or altars for sacrificing to distant gods, but instead served as warnings, as records, as desperate attempts to preserve knowledge of something that had happened, and something that those ancient builders feared would happen again. The animal symbols that writhe across the limestone surfaces, the scorpions poised to strike, the vultures eternally circling, the serpents frozen in their eternal dance, may not be mere decorative elements or totemic representations of clan identities, but could instead comprise a coded language speaking of events and knowledge that the builders deemed too important to risk being forgotten. Messages carved in the most permanent medium available to people who understood that everything else they could create would eventually crumble into dust and blow away on winds that have been erasing human achievements since our species first emerged from the depths of evolutionary time. And if we follow this thread of speculation to its logical conclusion, accepting the possibility that Göbekli Tepe represents an archive rather than a temple, a warning rather than a celebration, then we must confront the most unsettling question of all. What were they warning us about? What knowledge did they consider so vital that they invested decades of labor to encode it in stone and bury it for future discovery? And, most disturbingly, has whatever they were warning against already returned? Or is it approaching even now, as we stand here in our modern ignorance, congratulating ourselves on our technological sophistication while remaining blind to patterns that ancient eyes saw clearly? The symbols wait in the stone, patient as the earth itself, holding their secrets while we struggle to develop the wisdom necessary to decode them. And in the next chapter, we'll descend deeper into the mystery by examining those carvings with fresh eyes, exploring the possibility that what we've dismissed as primitive religious iconography may actually represent sophisticated astronomical knowledge, encoded warnings about cosmic catastrophes, and the first clues pointing toward beings that ancient civilizations across the globe described with remarkable consistency. The Anunnaki, those who from heaven came and who, according to the oldest stories ever written, promised they would someday return. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe stand covered in symbols that archaeologists initially dismissed as decorative flourishes or totemic representations of the animals that roamed the Neolithic landscape. But as researchers have spent years studying the precise arrangement, orientation, and relationships between these carvings, a far more sophisticated picture has emerged. One that suggests the builders possessed astronomical knowledge so advanced that it challenges our comfortable assumptions about the intellectual capabilities of people living 12,000 years ago, in a world we've always imagined as dominated by ignorance and superstition. Among the dozens of pillars excavated from the ancient complex, one stands out with such striking astronomical precision that it has forced even skeptical scientists to reconsider whether these carvings might represent something far more significant than religious art. Pillar 43, known colloquially as the vulture stone, which bears imagery that researchers Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis from the University of Edinburgh argue depicts not mythological scenes, but rather an actual astronomical event. Specifically, the catastrophic comet impact that occurred around 10,950 BCE, coinciding exactly with the beginning of the Younger Dryas period, a sudden climate catastrophe that plunged the world back into Ice Age conditions and may have devastated whatever advanced civilizations existed at the time. The vulture stone presents us with a complex tableau of symbols, arranged in what appears to be deliberate astronomical configuration. A vulture with wings spread wide dominates the composition, surrounded by a menagerie of creatures, including a scorpion positioned at the pillar's base, a serpent coiling upward along the stone's edge, and most intriguingly, a series of circular symbols that Sweatman and Tsikritsis argue correspond to specific constellations visible in the night sky during the period when Göbekli Tepe was constructed. Using sophisticated computer simulations that can recreate the exact positions of stars and constellations as they would have appeared thousands of years ago, these researchers demonstrated that the symbols on Pillar 43 match the stellar configuration that would have been visible on the date when geological and ice core evidence suggests a massive comet struck the Earth, triggering wildfires across multiple continents, causing extinction of numerous megafauna species, including mammoths and saber-toothed cats, and potentially wiping out human populations across vast regions of the planet. The headless human figure carved at the center of the stone, which earlier archaeologists had interpreted as representing a priest or shaman in some forgotten ritual, takes on far more ominous meaning. Viewed as a memorial to catastrophe, humanity decapitated, civilization beheaded, knowledge severed from the body of culture that had accumulated it over unknown millennia before the sky fell and fire consumed the world our ancestors had built. This interpretation transforms Göbekli Tepe from a curious archaeological anomaly into something far more urgent and purposeful. A monument built by survivors who had witnessed apocalypse firsthand, who had seen their world consumed by cosmic fire, who had watched their civilization collapse, while the few remaining humans huddled in terror as the sky burned and the earth shook with impacts that carved craters miles wide into the planet's surface, and who were determined that future generations should never forget that such catastrophes could happen again. The precision required to encode astronomical events into stone carvings demonstrates a level of observational astronomy that we've always assumed was beyond the reach of Neolithic peoples. Yet the evidence carved into Göbekli Tepe's pillars suggests that our assumptions have been catastrophically wrong, that the people who survived the Younger Dryas impact possessed sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics, tracked the movements of stars and planets with meticulous care, and recognized patterns in the cosmos that we, in our modern arrogance, have only recently rediscovered using computers and telescopes and mathematical models, that ancient observers achieved through nothing but patient watching of the night sky across generations. The phenomenon of ancient astronomical knowledge that surpasses what we believe possible for primitive peoples appears not just at Göbekli Tepe, but across multiple ancient civilizations, in a pattern that becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence the more examples accumulate before our incredulous modern eyes. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a Roman-era shipwreck off the coast of Greece, is an astronomical calculator of such sophistication that when first examined by researchers in the early 20th century, many dismissed it as an impossible anachronism or even a hoax, because its complex gear systems and precise calculations seemed to require knowledge of planetary motions that shouldn't have existed 2,000 years ago. The Mayan calendar system, which tracks cycles within cycles with mathematical precision extending thousands of years into both past and future, demonstrates understanding of celestial periods, including the precession of the equinoxes, a 26,000-year cycle caused by Earth's axial wobble that European astronomers wouldn't discover until the Renaissance. The Great Pyramid of Giza aligns with true north to a precision of less than 1/15 of a degree, a feat that requires astronomical knowledge and surveying techniques that Egyptologists still debate, because the tools we know existed in the Old Kingdom seem inadequate for achieving such accuracy, while the pyramid's internal chambers align perfectly with specific stars in Orion's belt, as they would have appeared in the skies above Egypt 4,500 years ago, suggesting that the builders possessed not just engineering prowess, but also deep astronomical knowledge encoded into the very stones of their greatest monument. Modern society tracks near-Earth asteroids with obsessive vigilance, maintaining databases of potentially hazardous objects, funding space missions designed to detect and potentially deflect incoming threats, and running computer simulations of impact scenarios. Because we understand with crystal clarity that extinction can arrive from the cosmic void with very little warning, arriving in the form of a rock traveling at tens of thousands of miles per hour that could vaporize cities, trigger global firestorms, and plunge civilization into collapse within hours of impact. Yet, we somehow find it difficult to imagine that ancient peoples might have possessed similar concerns, might have watched the skies with equal vigilance, might have recorded their observations in the most permanent medium available to ensure that future generations would understand the threat and maintain their own vigilant watch against the return of fire from heaven. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, while still debated among researchers who cling to alternative explanations for the sudden climate shift and megafauna extinctions, gains support from accumulating evidence, including a thin layer of platinum deposited globally at precisely the right depth in geological strata, widespread evidence of massive wildfires occurring simultaneously across continents, and the mysterious carbon spherules and nanodiamonds that form only under the extreme temperatures and pressures associated with cosmic impacts, all pointing toward a catastrophic event that would have been visible to any humans lucky enough to survive the initial devastation. Among the many enigmatic symbols carved into Göbekli Tepe's pillars and appearing with uncanny consistency across ancient sites separated by vast oceans and thousands of years, one particular image stands out for its inexplicable ubiquity. A rectangular object resembling a handbag or bucket, held by anthropomorphic figures in artistic traditions that supposedly never had contact with each other, but which nonetheless reproduce this identical symbol with precision that defies explanation through coincidence or parallel evolution of symbolic thinking. This handbag appears carved into Sumerian reliefs from ancient Mesopotamia, where it's held by figures described in cuneiform texts as the Anunnaki or other divine beings. It appears in stone sculptures from the Olmec and other Mesoamerican cultures, carried by figures that local traditions describe as gods or culture bringers who taught humanity agriculture and astronomy. It appears on massive stone structures on Easter Island, that isolated speck of land in the vast Pacific, where ancient Polynesian culture developed in supposed isolation from any other civilization. And it appears at Göbekli Tepe itself, carved into pillars by people who lived thousands of years before the Sumerians would develop writing, raising the disturbing question of how such a specific, distinctive symbol could propagate across civilizations that academic consensus insists had no contact with each other. Imagine discovering that civilizations separated by oceans and millennia all independently developed not just similar symbols, but identical ones, as if they were all downloading the same app icon from some shared source that transcends the boundaries of time and geography that we use to organize our understanding of how cultural symbols develop and spread through human populations. The standard archaeological explanation that simple geometric shapes naturally recur in human art and any similarities are mere coincidence becomes increasingly strained when the symbols are not simple geometric forms, but rather highly specific representations of objects with particular details that remain consistent across vastly separated cultures. The handbag symbol, with its distinctive rectangular body and curved handle, its specific proportions maintained across thousands of miles and thousands of years, suggests either an impossibly unlikely series of coincidences, or, alternatively, points toward some kind of shared origin, some common source from which all these disparate cultures drew their inspiration, some actual object or technology that was significant enough to be memorialized in stone by peoples who otherwise left very different artistic and cultural traditions behind, for us to puzzle over in museums and archaeological journals. Into this mystery of astronomical knowledge and recurring symbols across separated civilizations, we must now introduce the most controversial element of all: the Sumerian texts describing the Anunnaki, those beings whose very name in ancient Sumerian translates as those who from heaven to earth came, who, according to cuneiform tablets, painstakingly translated by scholars over the past century and a half, descended from the skies to teach humanity agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, and all the other foundational elements of civilization that transformed our ancestors from scattered hunter-gatherers into organized societies capable of building cities, developing complex religious systems, and creating artistic and literary traditions that would survive through millennia to reach our modern eyes. The Sumerian civilization emerges into the archaeological record around 4000 BCE in southern Mesopotamia, appearing seemingly overnight with fully developed cuneiform writing, sophisticated mathematics, including understanding of astronomical cycles, advanced irrigation techniques, complex religious hierarchies, and architectural capabilities that allowed them to construct ziggurats and temple complexes that would dominate the landscape of ancient Iraq. And when later generations asked the Sumerians how they acquired all this knowledge, how they progressed so rapidly from primitive villages to advanced civilization, the answer, recorded in their oldest texts, was unambiguous. The Anunnaki taught them everything. The temporal puzzle becomes even more intriguing when we arrange these civilizations and events along a timeline that reveals patterns too striking to dismiss entirely. Göbekli Tepe is constructed around 9600 BCE by survivors of the Younger Dryas catastrophe, who encoded astronomical knowledge into pillars covered with symbols, including the mysterious handbag. The site is deliberately and carefully buried around 8000 BCE, for reasons that remain opaque to modern researchers despite decades of speculation. 4000 years of relative archaeological silence follow, during which human societies slowly develop agricultural techniques and establish the first permanent settlements. Then, suddenly, around 4000 BCE, the Sumerian civilization appears in Mesopotamia, with fully developed writing, advanced mathematics, and explicit texts, crediting the Anunnaki with teaching them the foundations of civilization, while similar stories of sky beings or gods descending to teach humanity appear independently in Egyptian, Indian, Mesoamerican, and other ancient cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other. What happened during those 4,000 missing years between Göbekli Tepe's burial and Sumer's emergence? And, more disturbingly, what if the connection between these events isn't coincidental, but rather represents a coherent pattern that we've failed to recognize because our modern assumptions blind us to possibilities that ancient peoples recorded as straightforward historical accounts? The mainstream archaeological interpretation of the Anunnaki relegates them firmly to the category of mythology. They were gods invented by ancient Mesopotamians to explain natural phenomena, to provide divine sanction for political authority, to satisfy human psychological needs for supernatural protection and guidance, and to serve all the other functions that scholars have identified as the reasons societies develop religious beliefs and pantheons of deities. But this comfortable dismissal becomes harder to maintain when we actually read what the Sumerian texts say about these beings. Descriptions that emphasize not their supernatural or mystical qualities, but rather their technological capabilities, their physical presence walking among humans, their role as teachers of practical knowledge rather than objects of pure worship, and their eventual departure from Earth, with explicit promises that they would return when the proper time arrived, when certain astronomical cycles completed, when humanity reached sufficient development to merit their renewed attention. The Anunnaki of Sumerian literature possessed what the texts describe as me, a word scholars translate inadequately as divine powers, but which the contexts suggest might better be understood as knowledge, technology, or understanding of natural laws that allowed these beings to accomplish feats that seemed miraculous to observers who lacked similar understanding, much as a modern human demonstrating a smartphone or helicopter to an isolated tribal society would be interpreted as a god wielding magic, rather than a technologically advanced visitor from a more developed culture. When we examine ancient Sumerian art with fresh eyes, unclouded by academic assumptions about what is and isn't possible in ancient contexts, we find depictions that unsettle comfortable categories. Cylinder seals showing the Anunnaki holding objects that look suspiciously like technological devices. Reliefs depicting figures wearing what appear to be wristwatches or communication devices. Images of beings that seem to be wearing helmets or protective gear rather than ceremonial headdresses, and most famously, the enigmatic representations of what Zecharia Sitchin controversially interpreted as diagrams of the solar system, including planets that wouldn't be officially discovered until the invention of telescopes thousands of years later. The scholarly consensus dismisses Sitchin's interpretations as pseudo-archaeology, driven by predetermined conclusions rather than careful analysis. And certainly, his translations and theories contain elements that professional Assyriologists correctly identify as mistaken or unsupported by proper linguistic analysis of cuneiform texts. But the core question his work raises remains uncomfortably valid. If ancient peoples worldwide consistently describe contact with advanced beings who descended from the sky, taught them civilization's foundations, and departed with promises to return, at what point does dismissing all these accounts as mere mythology become less scientifically rigorous than considering whether they might preserve, however distorted by millennia of retelling, memories of actual historical events that our current paradigms cannot accommodate? The handbag symbol, the astronomical knowledge encoded in monuments that predate writing, the consistent, worldwide traditions of sky beings teaching humanity, and the sudden appearance of advanced civilizations with fully developed knowledge systems all point toward a possibility that makes academic gatekeepers deeply uncomfortable. What if Göbekli Tepe wasn't built by the Anunnaki or their equivalents, but rather was built because of them, as a memorial to their previous visit, as a warning about the catastrophes that accompanied their arrival or departure, as an archive preserving knowledge they had taught in case they didn't return for longer than expected, as a message to future generations about truths that the survivors of the Younger Dryas impact considered too important to risk being forgotten, even if that meant investing decades of labor into carving symbols into megalithic pillars and burying the entire complex to protect it from time's erosion. And if this speculation contains even a grain of truth, then the symbols waiting to be fully decoded on those ancient stones might tell us not just about our past, but about our future. About patterns that repeat across cosmic timescales that dwarf human history. About returns and departures that follow cycles we're only beginning to recognize. Which brings us to the most unsettling question that emerges from the pillars of Göbekli Tepe. If the Anunnaki, or beings like them, did indeed depart our world thousands of years ago, with promises encoded in the mythologies of every ancient culture, that they would someday return, then what exactly are they returning for? And how will we recognize the signs of their approach if we cannot even properly decode the warnings our ancestors left, carved in stone? The ancient Sumerian tablets, pressed into wet clay by scribes working in the hot Mesopotamian sun over 4,000 years ago, tell stories that sound more like science fiction than religious mythology, describing in matter-of-fact detail how beings called the Anunnaki descended from the heavens in vehicles that roared like thunder and shone like fire, established settlements in the river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates, created humanity through what the texts describe as a process involving mixing divine essence with earthly clay, in a manner that sounds disturbingly like genetic engineering when translated through the lens of modern biological understanding, and ruled as god-kings who walked among their human subjects, teaching agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, and all the other foundational knowledge that would transform scattered tribes into the world's first recognizable civilization. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that draws heavily from older Sumerian sources, describes not a simple act of divine creation, but rather a complex, cosmic history involving multiple generations of these beings, conflicts between different factions, the establishment of order from chaos, through what reads less like mystical transformation and more like deliberate engineering of planetary conditions, and the eventual creation of humans explicitly to serve as workers who would free the Anunnaki from the labor of managing Earth's resources, a practical economic motivation that seems jarringly mundane for beings we'd been taught to regard as gods dwelling in transcendent spiritual realms beyond material concerns. Zecharia Sitchin, the controversial Russian-born scholar whose translations and interpretations of Sumerian texts ignited decades of debate and spawned entire industries of ancient astronaut theories, argued that the Sumerian accounts should be read not as allegorical mythology, but as historical records describing actual events involving extraterrestrial visitors from a planet the Sumerians called Nibiru, which Sitchin identified as a massive world following an extremely elliptical orbit through our solar system that brings it close to Earth once every 3,600 years, before swinging back out into the deep reaches of space beyond the orbit of Pluto. According to Sitchin's interpretation of texts that mainstream Assyriologists insist he mistranslated or misunderstood, the Anunnaki came to Earth approximately 450,000 years ago, seeking gold, which they needed to repair their planet's deteriorating atmosphere. And they initially mined the precious metal themselves until the labor became too burdensome, and they decided to create a primitive worker species by genetically modifying the hominids already present on Earth, thereby producing Homo sapiens as a hybrid species, combining Anunnaki genetics with terrestrial DNA. An origin story that Sitchin claimed explains the mysterious missing link in human evolution: the sudden appearance of anatomically modern humans with dramatically increased cognitive capabilities that paleoanthropologists struggle to explain through gradual evolutionary processes alone. The scholarly establishment's response to Sitchin's theories has been overwhelmingly negative, with professional Assyriologists and linguists pointing out numerous errors in his translations, his tendency to read modern concepts into ancient texts, his selective use of evidence that supports his predetermined conclusions while ignoring contradictory information, and his lack of formal training in the languages he claimed to translate. All valid criticisms that nevertheless don't entirely address the core questions his work raises about how we should interpret ancient texts that consistently describe beings from the sky, who possessed powers and knowledge far exceeding normal human capabilities. When mainstream scholars translate the same Sumerian tablets, they produce accounts of gods who live in heaven, who occasionally descend to Earth to interact with humans, who teach useful skills to their favored servants, and who eventually withdraw from direct involvement in human affairs. Interpretations that classify these beings firmly in the category of mythological deities, invented to explain natural phenomena and provide religious meaning to human existence. But this categorical dismissal becomes harder to maintain when we notice the remarkable specificity and consistency of descriptions across multiple ancient cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other, yet tell essentially the same story, with only minor variations in names and local details. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest surviving literary works, describes its hero king as being 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, the product of a union between a goddess and a mortal man. And while modern scholars interpret this as mythological ancestry designed to legitimize royal authority, the text itself presents this mixed heritage as biological fact that explains Gilgamesh's superhuman strength and extended lifespan, characteristics that the story attributes to his partial Anunnaki genetics rather than to divine blessing or supernatural intervention. Throughout the epic, Gilgamesh encounters beings described as gods, who nonetheless eat, drink, engage in sexual relations, experience emotions including anger and jealousy, and generally behave more like a technologically advanced species than like transcendent spiritual entities. And when Gilgamesh seeks immortality, after witnessing his friend Enkidu's death, he journeys to find Utnapishtim, the Mesopotamian Noah, who survived a great flood that the gods unleashed to destroy humanity. A cataclysmic event described in geological terms involving rain, earthquakes, and massive water displacement, rather than miraculous supernatural transformation of reality's fabric. The flood narrative itself appears across virtually every ancient culture, with such consistency that even the most skeptical scholars acknowledge some historical event must underlie these widespread traditions. The biblical account of Noah and the Ark that preserved breeding pairs of all animals. The Mesopotamian Atrahasis epic, where the god Enki warns his faithful servant about the coming deluge and instructs him in building a vessel to survive. The Greek story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who repopulate the world after Zeus destroys humanity with floods. The Hindu Matsya Purana, describing how the fish avatar Vishnu warns Manu about waters that will cover the earth. Indigenous American traditions, from dozens of tribes, describing great floods that destroyed previous worlds. And Australian Aboriginal stories of rising seas that drowned the land. Stories that archaeological evidence now confirms as accurate memories of actual sea level rise following the last ice age, suggesting that oral traditions can preserve historical memories across thousands of years, despite academic assumptions that such distant events would be forgotten, distorted beyond recognition. The standard scholarly explanation attributes these universal flood myths to various local flooding events that each culture independently mythologized. But this interpretation struggles to account for the specific, shared details that recur across separated traditions. The advance warning given to favored individuals by divine beings. The instruction to build specialized vessels following precise specifications. The preservation of animals and seeds to restart life after the catastrophe. And, most intriguingly, the consistent framing of the flood as punishment or cleansing, initiated by gods who grew dissatisfied with humanity's development or behavior. What makes the Anunnaki particularly fascinating, compared to other mythological pantheons, is the explicitly technological flavor of their descriptions in Sumerian texts, where they possess me that the stories describe as discrete objects or knowledge packages that can be transferred between beings, stolen, lost, or deliberately given as gifts to favored humans, very much like data storage devices or instruction manuals, rather than ineffable mystical powers that emerge spontaneously from divine nature. The goddess Inanna's descent to the underworld involves her carefully donning 7 specific me before her journey, and having them systematically removed at each gate she passes through, suggesting these were actual objects rather than abstract qualities, while the myth of Inanna's theft of the me from the god Enki describes her getting him drunk and then literally taking possession of over 100 different me that govern everything from kingship to metalworking to music to sexual practices, physical items that she loads onto her boat and transports to her own city. Behavior that makes perfect sense if these were technological devices or knowledge databases, but seems bizarre if we're supposed to interpret them as divine attributes or mystical powers. The Sumerian king lists, which chronicle rulers from before the flood through historical dynasties, matter-of-factly record reigns lasting thousands or tens of thousands of years for the earliest kings. Periods that scholars dismiss as mythological exaggeration, but which the texts present as straightforward chronology. And these impossibly long reigns appear specifically for rulers described as having direct Anunnaki heritage, or as having been appointed by the Anunnaki themselves, suggesting that either the Sumerians were wildly confused about how time works, or they were recording actual biological differences between humans with partial Anunnaki genetics and purely human individuals. The ancient astronaut theory that Sitchin's work popularized proposes that the Anunnaki were literal extraterrestrial beings who visited Earth, genetically engineered humanity, and established themselves as gods in human memory, before eventually departing with promises to return. An interpretation that professional archaeologists and historians overwhelmingly reject as pseudoscience that misreads ancient texts through a modern technological lens and ignores the rich complexity of ancient religious thought in favor of reductionist explanations that treat mythology as garbled history, rather than as sophisticated symbolic systems encoding spiritual and social truths. Yet, if we're honest about the logical consistency of these critiques, we must acknowledge the profound irony that contemporary civilization invests billions of dollars in SETI programs, scanning the cosmos for radio signals from alien civilizations, sends probes beyond our solar system, carrying messages intended for extraterrestrial discovery, seriously discusses protocols for first contact scenarios, and plans missions to potentially habitable exoplanets, all based on the assumption that intelligent life likely exists elsewhere, in a universe containing billions of galaxies, each holding billions of stars, while simultaneously treating as ridiculous pseudoscience the possibility that such aliens might have already visited Earth during the hundreds of thousands of years that humans and our hominid ancestors have inhabited this planet. We scan the skies, desperately hoping to detect signals from beings we've never encountered, while dismissing as impossible mythology the claims of every ancient culture that beings from the sky did indeed visit, did teach our ancestors, and did promise to return. A contradiction that says more about modern academic biases than about the objective evaluation of evidence. If modern humans, equipped with helicopters, smartphones, antibiotics, and solar panels, were to visit an isolated tribal society that had developed without contact with technological civilization, how would those tribal peoples describe the encounter to their descendants generations later, when the visitors had departed? They would speak of beings who descended from the sky in roaring metal birds, who possessed magic devices that could capture images and communicate across vast distances, who could heal diseases with miraculous substances, who could create light without fire, and predict the movements of celestial bodies with impossible accuracy, who taught valuable knowledge about agriculture and tool-making, before eventually departing in their sky vehicles with promises to perhaps return someday. And their descendants would debate whether these visitors were gods, spirits, ancestors, or perhaps just symbolic representations of natural forces and human psychological needs. The parallel to how we treat ancient accounts of the Anunnaki becomes uncomfortably clear when we perform this thought experiment, forcing us to question whether our categorical rejection of ancient astronaut theories stems from actual evidence against extraterrestrial contact, or rather, from intellectual discomfort with possibilities that don't fit neatly into the paradigms that govern modern academic discourse and professional advancement in fields where challenging orthodox interpretations can end careers before they properly begin. The cyclical nature of these divine visitations appears repeatedly across ancient traditions in a pattern that becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidental the more examples accumulate before our consideration. The Mayan long count calendar, which tracks cycles within cycles with mathematical precision, culminated in 2012, according to popular interpretation, marking what Mayan texts describe as the end of one world age and the beginning of another. Transitions that their mythology associates with the return of Kukulkan, or Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent deity who their traditions say brought civilization before departing across the Eastern Sea, with promises to return when the calendar wheel completed its revolution. Hindu cosmology describes vast cycles called yugas, spanning hundreds of thousands of years, with different ages characterized by different levels of divine involvement in human affairs. And according to these ancient calculations, we currently exist in the Kali Yuga, the age of decline and chaos that precedes the return of Vishnu in his final avatar to cleanse the world and initiate a new Golden Age. Norse mythology speaks of Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when the old world will be destroyed and a new world will emerge from the ashes. A cyclical destruction and renewal that the Eddas present not as a final apocalypse, but as part of an eternal pattern of death and rebirth, operating at cosmic scales that dwarf human comprehension. Egyptian traditions describe the first time, Zep Tepi, when the gods walked the earth and established civilization, followed by their gradual withdrawal and the promise of their eventual return when the great cycles complete their rotations and the cosmos aligns properly once more. What unites these disparate traditions from cultures separated by oceans and millennia is the consistent theme of divine or advanced beings who arrive, civilize humanity, depart, and promise to return when certain cycles complete or certain conditions are met. A pattern that could represent either universal human psychological archetypes emerging independently across all societies, or, alternatively, could preserve distorted memories of actual cyclical contact with a non-human intelligence that operates on timescales vastly different from the decades and centuries that bound human historical consciousness. Sitchin's controversial claim that Nibiru follows a 3,600-year elliptical orbit provides a mathematical framework for this cyclical return, if we accept his astronomical interpretations. And while mainstream astronomers reject the possibility of such a planet existing within our solar system, based on the lack of gravitational evidence and the instability such an orbit would create, the recent discovery of distant trans-Neptunian objects following highly elliptical orbits and the ongoing search, the hypothetical Planet 9, suggests that our solar system may yet hold surprises that challenge current models. If the Anunnaki last appeared during the Bronze Age collapse, around 1600 BCE, a period when multiple advanced civilizations around the Mediterranean simultaneously failed, for reasons that still puzzle historians, despite decades of research into possible causes ranging from climate change to mysterious invaders to systems collapse. Then a 3,600-year cycle would place their next return somewhere around the year 2000, give or take a few decades, accounting for uncertainties in ancient chronology and the gradual drift of calendars over millennia. The question of whether the Anunnaki were literal extraterrestrial visitors, metaphorical representations of natural forces, or psychological archetypes, distorted memories of advanced human civilizations predating known history, or something stranger that our current categories cannot adequately capture, remains unresolved, despite decades of passionate argument from all sides of these debates. But what cannot be disputed is that Göbekli Tepe and similar sites demonstrate that our ancestors possessed capabilities and knowledge far exceeding what we've assumed possible for their supposed developmental level. That ancient texts worldwide consistently describe contact with advanced beings from the sky, using language that emphasizes physical presence and technological capability, rather than purely spiritual transcendence. And that these same texts promise with striking consistency that these beings will return when cosmic cycles align and humanity reaches sufficient development to merit renewed contact. The symbols carved into Göbekli Tepe's pillars, the astronomical knowledge encoded in monuments across the globe, and the persistent traditions of sky gods teaching civilization, all point toward a past far stranger and more complex than conventional archaeology acknowledges. And if that past was characterized by cyclical contact with non-human intelligence, then the most urgent question becomes not whether ancient astronaut theories are respectable, but rather whether we're approaching another turn of the cosmic wheel, another return of beings that shaped our species' development in ways we're only beginning to recognize, and whether the warnings our ancestors encoded in stone and story were meant specifically for us, the generation alive when the cycle's complete, and the Anunnaki, or whatever we choose to call them, come back to see what we've done with the knowledge they left behind. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe around 8000 BCE presents us with a puzzle that becomes more rather than less mysterious the longer we contemplate it. Because this wasn't abandonment through neglect or destruction through conquest, but rather was a careful, methodical process, requiring hundreds or thousands of workers to transport earth and fill in the spaces between pillars with such precision that the site remained remarkably well preserved through the subsequent 10 millennia, suggesting that whoever ordered this massive undertaking understood they were creating not a tomb, but a time capsule, not erasing their greatest achievement, but rather protecting it from the erosions of time and the destructive tendencies of future generations, who might not understand the critical importance of the knowledge encoded in those carved stones. When we consider the timing of this burial in relation to the cataclysmic events that preceded Göbekli Tepe's construction, a coherent narrative begins to emerge from the archaeological evidence. The Younger Dryas impact, around 10,950 BCE, devastated whatever civilizations existed at that time, killing off megafauna across multiple continents, triggering climate chaos that plunged the world back into Ice Age conditions, and reducing human populations to scattered survivors who watched their world burn under skies filled with smoke from wildfires that consumed forests across vast regions of the planet. Then, in the immediate aftermath of this catastrophe, while memories of the destruction remained fresh and urgent. The survivors constructed Göbekli Tepe as a monument to what they had lost, and as a warning to future generations about dangers that could descend from the heavens with terrifying suddenness to transform a thriving world into an ash-covered wasteland. The hypothesis that Göbekli Tepe was built by survivors of a previous advanced civilization, rather than by primitive hunter-gatherers emerging slowly from Stone Age ignorance, would explain numerous anomalies that conventional archaeology struggles to address through traditional frameworks that insist on slow, gradual development of human capabilities over tens of thousands of years before sophisticated architecture becomes possible. The engineering knowledge required to quarry, transport, and erect 20-ton pillars doesn't emerge spontaneously from societies that supposedly possessed only the most rudimentary tools and organizational structures. But rather, such knowledge represents the accumulated wisdom of generations of builders, refining techniques through trial and error across centuries or millennia of progressively more ambitious construction projects. Yet, Göbekli Tepe appears in the archaeological record without any preceding developmental sequence, without smaller practice structures showing the gradual acquisition of skills, without the expected progression from simple to complex that characterizes every other architectural tradition in human history. The astronomical knowledge encoded in the pillar arrangements and carvings similarly suggests inheritance from an older tradition, rather than independent discovery by traumatized refugees struggling to survive in a post-apocalyptic landscape. Because tracking the precession of equinoxes and recording stellar configurations with precision sufficient to mark specific dates requires patient observation across multiple human lifetimes, requires stable societies with surplus resources to support professional astronomer priests, requires the kind of institutional continuity that develops only when civilizations have moved far beyond mere survival mode into periods of cultural flourishing that produce art, science, and monumental architecture as expressions of accumulated knowledge and social confidence. Returning to Pillar 43, the vulture stone, with the context of Göbekli Tepe as archive rather than temple, transforms our interpretation of its cryptic imagery from religious symbolism into something far more urgent and specific. A memorial marker identifying the exact astronomical configuration during the cataclysm that destroyed the previous world. A warning sign telling future humans, this happened before, and it can happen again. A desperate attempt to preserve knowledge of cosmic dangers in the only medium the builders trusted to survive through whatever future catastrophes might befall their descendants. The researchers Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis, whose work matching the vulture stone's symbols to actual stellar positions during the Younger Dryas impact has been met with skepticism by conventional archaeologists, but has also garnered increasing support from scientists willing to examine the evidence without preconceived assumptions about what Neolithic peoples could or couldn't achieve, argue that the headless human figure at the composition's center represents not a ritual participant or mythological character, but rather humanity itself, decapitated by catastrophe, civilization beheaded and disconnected from the body of knowledge that previous generations had accumulated through countless centuries of observation and experimentation. The various animals surrounding this central figure, the vulture with wings spread wide as if to encompass the entire sky, The scorpion, positioned with mathematical precision at the base of the pillar. The serpent, coiling through the composition like the path of a comet streaking across the heavens, may represent not totemic clan symbols or religious iconography, but rather specific constellations marking the date when fire fell from above, and the world that existed before Göbekli Tepe vanished into smoke and ash and traumatic memory. The universality of flood myths across human cultures takes on new significance when we recognize that the Younger Dryas impact would have caused exactly the kind of catastrophic flooding described in these ancient accounts. Because the enormous heat generated by comet fragments striking Ice Age glaciers would have released unimaginable volumes of meltwater in geological instants, sending walls of water surging across continents, drowning coastal settlements, and raising sea levels in sudden pulses that would have seemed like divine punishment to terrified survivors watching the ocean swallow their world. The biblical account of Noah describes rain falling for 40 days and nights, water rising to cover the highest mountains, and only a single family surviving in an ark built according to precise specifications provided by God. While the Mesopotamian accounts, from which the biblical story clearly derives, describe Utnapishtim receiving warning from the god Enki about the coming deluge, and instructions for building a vessel to preserve himself, his family, and representatives of all animal species. The Greek version tells of Deucalion and Pyrrha surviving waters sent by Zeus to destroy corrupt humanity, while Hindu texts describe Manu receiving similar warning and similar instructions from Vishnu in his fish avatar form. And indigenous traditions from the Americas to Australia to Pacific Islands all describe catastrophic floods that destroyed previous worlds. Stories that conventional scholarship attributes to various localized flooding events that each culture independently mythologized. An explanation that becomes increasingly strained when we notice the specific shared details appearing across these supposedly independent traditions. Advance warning from divine beings. Instructions for building specialized survival vessels. The preservation of breeding pairs or seeds to restart life after waters recede. And the consistent framing of the deluge as simultaneous punishment for human failings and opportunity for renewal through the survival of worthy individuals selected by gods who apparently wanted to preserve humanity despite destroying the civilization humans had built. What if all these traditions, from cultures separated by vast oceans and thousands of years, are describing the same actual event from different geographical perspectives, preserving, through oral transmission, the traumatic memory of the Younger Dryas catastrophe that archaeological and geological evidence increasingly confirms did indeed involve sudden, catastrophic flooding, massive die-offs of animal species, and climate chaos that would have devastated human populations across the globe. The conventional explanation that treats each flood myth as independent invention strains credulity when we examine the specific details that recur with such consistency. But acknowledging that these myths might preserve actual historical memory of a global catastrophe forces us to reconsider numerous other assumptions about how we evaluate ancient accounts, including their descriptions of the beings who provided warning and instruction to the survivors. Beings that the myths consistently describe as gods or divine messengers. but that we might alternatively interpret as members of a technologically advanced civilization who recognized the incoming danger and attempted to preserve at least some portion of humanity and accumulated knowledge through the coming devastation. The figure of Noah, or Utnapishtim, or Deucalion, receiving detailed construction specifications for vessels designed to survive unprecedented flooding, sounds less like primitive religious mythology and more like disaster preparedness instructions provided by those with scientific understanding of what was coming and what would be required to endure it. Much as modern scientists might provide survival instructions to isolated communities if we detected an incoming asteroid that would cause regional or global catastrophe. The arrogance of modern civilization, which assumes that we represent the pinnacle of human achievement and that all previous societies were necessarily more primitive and less knowledgeable than ourselves, blinds us to evidence that challenges this comfortable narrative of linear progress from ignorant past toward enlightened future. We congratulate ourselves on technological marvels like smartphones and space stations, while struggling to explain how ancient Egyptians achieved precision in their architecture that modern engineers still cannot replicate using traditional tools. How Inca stonemasons cut and fitted blocks with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters without metal tools or mortar. How Pacific navigators crossed thousands of miles of open ocean using only knowledge of stars and waves and birds, while European sailors still clung to coastlines for fear of getting lost. How ancient metallurgists produced Damascus steel and Greek fire and other substances whose exact composition remains unknown despite modern analytical techniques. And how Göbekli Tepe's builders organized the massive labor forces and possessed the engineering knowledge necessary for their constructions when they supposedly lacked agriculture, writing, metal tools, and all the other markers we associate with civilizations capable of such achievements. Perhaps the more accurate understanding recognizes that human cognitive capacity and innovative capability haven't changed significantly over the past 50,000 years, that our ancestors were every bit as intelligent and creative as we are, and that the primary difference between their world and ours lies not in mental capacity, but in accumulated knowledge and available resources, advantages that can disappear with terrifying speed when catastrophe strikes and libraries burn and cities crumble, and the survivors find themselves struggling to preserve even fragments of what previous generations knew. The possibility that Göbekli Tepe represents not the first flowering of civilization, but rather the last gasp of a previous civilization's attempt to preserve crucial knowledge through approaching catastrophe, reframes our entire understanding of what the site represents and why its builders invested such enormous effort in its construction and subsequent burial. If we imagine ourselves in the position of survivors who had witnessed the destruction of advanced societies through cosmic impact, who had watched cities burn and populations collapse and knowledge vanish as those who held it died in the chaos, who understood that future generations would need warnings about these cosmic dangers and guidance for rebuilding civilization if catastrophe struck again, then the construction of Göbekli Tepe begins to make sense as a rational response to irrational circumstances, rather than as an inexplicable anomaly in the archaeological record. The astronomical alignments encoded in the pillars' positions and the stellar configurations carved into their surfaces serve as permanent records of when the previous catastrophe occurred and what signs to watch for in the skies that might herald the next one. Information that could help future humans recognize danger and perhaps take protective measures if their civilization had developed sufficient technological capability by the time the cycles brought new threats from the cosmic void. The animal symbols that earlier researchers interpreted as totemic religious iconography might instead represent a sophisticated symbolic language encoding knowledge of astronomy, natural cycles, survival techniques, and other crucial information that the builders desperately wanted to preserve for whatever humans might eventually excavate the site and possess sufficient knowledge to decode its messages. The decision to bury Göbekli Tepe after approximately 1,200 years of use makes sense if we understand the site as fundamentally an archive rather than an active religious center, because archives need protection from the elements, from human conflict, from the endless erosion that time inflicts on exposed structures. And the builders may have recognized that burial offered the best chance for long-term preservation of the knowledge encoded in those pillars. Imagine if contemporary civilization recognized that catastrophic collapse was approaching, and we wanted to preserve crucial knowledge for whoever might survive and rebuild. We wouldn't leave our most important information in exposed locations, vulnerable to fire, flood, bombing, or gradual decay, but rather would create protected repositories deep underground or in remote locations where geological stability and isolation from human conflict offered the best chances for long-term survival of whatever we deemed most essential for future humans to know. The builders of Göbekli Tepe may have reached similar conclusions, recognizing that their carved pillars needed protection that could only be provided through deliberate burial, creating a time capsule that would wait patiently through millennia until future humans developed sufficient archaeological sophistication to excavate carefully rather than destroying what they didn't understand. And perhaps hoping that when the site was eventually discovered, humanity would have advanced far enough to recognize the warnings encoded in stone and take them seriously, rather than dismissing them as primitive religious art. The return mechanism that ancient texts attribute to the Anunnaki and their equivalents in other cultural traditions might represent not literal extraterrestrial beings following orbital cycles, but rather a more subtle pattern of human civilizational development, punctuated by catastrophic collapses and slow rebuilding, with the gods representing the surviving knowledge bearers from each previous iteration, who attempt to preserve and pass on crucial information to help the next cycle of civilization develop more rapidly, and perhaps avoid the mistakes or misfortunes that destroyed their predecessors. In this interpretation, the Anunnaki aren't aliens from Nibiru, but rather are the priests, astronomers, engineers, and other knowledge keepers from pre-Younger Dryas civilizations who survived the catastrophe and worked to restart civilization by teaching agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, and other foundational knowledge to the scattered human populations who had regressed to subsistence living during the collapse, establishing themselves as God Kings in the collective memory of peoples who had lost the context to understand that these teachers were themselves human rather than supernatural. Just humans who had preserved knowledge that seemed miraculous to those who had lost it. The cyclical returns described in mythology would then represent not the physical return of the same beings, but rather the periodic emergence of new knowledge keepers when civilizations reach sufficient development to produce the surplus resources and social complexity necessary for specialized scholarly classes who can dedicate themselves to astronomy, engineering, and other disciplines that require generations of patient study to master. But if we're honest with ourselves, this rationalistic interpretation, while more palatable to modern sensibilities trained to reject supernatural explanations, still leaves enormous questions unanswered and struggles to account for the specific details that recur across ancient accounts with such stubborn consistency, particularly the descriptions of technological capabilities that seem to exceed anything achievable with Stone Age or Bronze Age tools and knowledge. The claims of beings who descended from the sky, rather than traveling overland from surviving population centers. The promises of return tied to specific astronomical cycles, rather than to vague future times. And the physical descriptions of these beings that ancient texts present as factually different from normal humans in ways that go beyond metaphorical language about divine nature or royal status. Whether we interpret the Anunnaki as literal extraterrestrials, as survivors of previous advanced human civilizations, as metaphorical representations of humanity's own developmental stages, or as something stranger that our current categories cannot adequately capture, the symbols waiting in the stone at Göbekli Tepe remain, patient as the earth that protected them for 10,000 years, offering knowledge to those with sufficient wisdom to read what was written there by hands that turned to dust. Before the pyramids rose, and before Sumerian scribes first pressed cuneiform into clay to record the stories the Anunnaki had taught them about where humans came from and what cosmic cycles governed the universe they inhabited. And now, in our present moment, as modern civilization races toward technological singularity or catastrophic collapse, depending on which experts we choose to believe, perhaps the time has finally arrived when we need to seriously consider what our ancestors were trying so desperately to tell us, and whether the return they warned about and promised is approaching faster than our comfortable assumptions about reality can accommodate. We stand now in the year 2025 at a convergence point in human history that would seem utterly bizarre to someone examining our circumstances from the objective distance that future historians might eventually achieve. Because we find ourselves simultaneously wielding technological capabilities that would appear as magic to our ancestors from even a century ago, while also facing existential threats that could extinguish our civilization as thoroughly as the Younger Dryas catastrophe extinguished whatever advanced societies existed 12,000 years before. And perhaps most significantly, we're experiencing a fundamental shift in official attitudes toward the possibility of non-human intelligence interacting with humanity. A shift exemplified by the United States Pentagon releasing previously classified footage of unidentified aerial phenomena that perform maneuvers defying our understanding of physics. By Congress holding public hearings where military officials testify under oath about encounters with craft exhibiting technological capabilities far beyond anything in known human arsenals. And by the quiet but unmistakable change in language from dismissive ridicule of UFOs to the more neutral, bureaucratic terminology of UAPs that allows serious discussion without the cultural baggage that decades of science fiction and government denials had attached to earlier framings of these phenomena. The question that anyone paying attention must ask themselves is whether this sudden shift in official acknowledgement represents merely a change in disclosure policies regarding phenomena that have always been present, or whether instead we're witnessing increased activity that has forced governments to acknowledge what they can no longer plausibly deny. And if the latter explanation holds truth, then we must confront the deeply unsettling possibility that something fundamental is changing in humanity's relationship with whatever non-human intelligences share our reality. Whether those intelligences originate from other star systems, from other dimensions of existence, from our own planet's hidden depths, or from human civilizations predating known history that have maintained themselves in isolation, while surface societies rose and fell through the grinding cycles of catastrophe and rebuilding. The technological context of our current moment adds layers of significance to questions about returning gods or ancient astronauts, because we've achieved capabilities that would allow us, for the first time in known history, to potentially recognize advanced technology as technology rather than as magic or divine intervention. Meaning that if the Anunnaki or their equivalents do return in our lifetimes, we might actually be able to comprehend what we're witnessing in rational rather than purely mythological terms. Much as a society that has developed radio astronomy can recognize the difference between natural cosmic radiation and artificial signals in ways that would be impossible for observers lacking the theoretical framework and detection instruments that modern science provides. Our development of artificial intelligence that increasingly challenges our comfortable assumptions about the uniqueness of human consciousness, our genetic engineering capabilities that allow us to modify organisms with precision that would have seemed godlike to previous generations, our quantum computers that exploit fundamental properties of reality in ways that still seem like magic even to many physicists who work with them, and our space programs that have sent probes beyond our solar system and established permanent human presence in orbit around our planet. All these achievements suggest that we may have reached a developmental threshold that ancient texts describe as necessary before the gods would return to evaluate what humanity has accomplished, with the knowledge they imparted during their previous visits. The patterns and synchronicities accumulating in our present moment become harder to dismiss as mere coincidence when we examine them comprehensively, rather than treating each element in isolation. Seismic activity has increased noticeably around ancient sites, including regions where Göbekli Tepe stands, with earthquakes striking with unusual frequency in areas that conventional geological models consider relatively stable. Our Sun has entered a period of heightened activity, with solar storms and coronal mass ejections occurring with increasing intensity. Behavior that could disrupt our technology-dependent civilization in ways that make our ancestors' dependence on seasonal rains seem quaintly manageable by comparison. The hypothetical Planet 9 that astronomers search for based on gravitational anomalies affecting trans-Neptunian objects happens to match uncomfortably well with Zecharia Sitchin's descriptions of Nibiru's orbital characteristics, despite mainstream astronomy dismissing Sitchin's work as pseudoscientific fantasy. And popular culture has become obsessed with ancient civilizations, with podcasts examining alternative history theories drawing audiences of millions, with documentaries about lost knowledge and pre-flood societies attracting mainstream attention rather than being relegated to fringe cable channels, and with a growing sense among significant portions of the population that conventional narratives about human history are incomplete at best and deliberately deceptive at worst. A collective awakening that could represent either mass delusion driven by internet-enabled conspiracy thinking, or, alternatively, could reflect some kind of species-level intuition that important revelations are approaching, and we need to prepare ourselves mentally and culturally for truths that will challenge everything we thought we knew about our origins and our place in cosmic history. If the return described in ancient texts does occur during our lifetimes, or our children's lifetimes, we must seriously contemplate what form such return might take, and whether we would even recognize it as fulfillment of ancient prophecies, rather than as unprecedented modern phenomena that we attempt to explain through contemporary frameworks that may be as inadequate for comprehending what's actually happening as Stone Age frameworks would be for understanding nuclear physics. The return might unfold through gradual revelation rather than sudden dramatic appearance, with increasing UAP sightings conditioning populations to accept non-human intelligence as fact rather than fiction, with archaeological discoveries like Göbekli Tepe forcing reconsideration of human capabilities and chronologies, with genetic research uncovering anomalies in human DNA that suggest intervention or engineering rather than purely natural evolution, and with astronomical observations detecting objects or phenomena that conventional astrophysics cannot easily explain, a slow accumulation of evidence that eventually reaches critical mass, forcing paradigm shift in how we understand ourselves and our relationship to whatever other intelligences inhabit or visit our reality. Alternatively, the return might arrive with the sudden, unmistakable drama that ancient accounts describe, with craft descending from the skies in numbers too great to deny or dismiss, with beings who claim responsibility for humanity's creation or guidance stepping forward to announce that the cosmic cycles have turned, and the time has come for direct contact and evaluation of what we've accomplished during their absence. With demonstrations of technological or consciousness-related capabilities so far beyond our current understanding that we must acknowledge these beings as either the gods our ancestors worshipped, or as advanced entities indistinguishable from gods by any practical measure that matters to humans trying to comprehend our suddenly transformed circumstances. The possibility that they have been here all along, watching from the shadows while maintaining a hands-off approach until humanity reached sufficient developmental maturity, parallels the prime directive concept from Star Trek, which proposes that advanced civilizations avoid interfering with less developed societies until those societies achieve certain technological and ethical thresholds that indicate readiness for contact with the broader galactic community. If such an ethical framework governs interactions between advanced intelligences and developing civilizations, then perhaps humanity has recently crossed whatever threshold was deemed necessary, explaining the increased sightings, the official acknowledgements, the growing sense that disclosure is approaching, whether through governmental revelation or through undeniable events that force the issue beyond any bureaucracy's ability to control the narrative. The specific signs that might indicate approaching return remain ambiguous, precisely because we're trying to recognize patterns that might operate according to logics and timescales completely foreign to human experience. Like an ant colony trying to predict human behavior based on observations of footsteps that appear randomly from the colony's perspective, but actually follow human purposes and patterns operating at scales the ants cannot perceive. And perhaps the synchronicities we notice, the astronomical anomalies, the seismic patterns, the cultural obsessions with ancient mysteries, the official acknowledgements of UAPs, are merely the shadow cast by movements in dimensions of reality that we lack the sensory apparatus or conceptual frameworks to directly observe. Returning to Göbekli Tepe itself, with the perspective of everything we've explored through these chapters, standing among those ancient pillars, carved with symbols that have waited 10,000 years for humans capable of reading their messages, we must confront the possibility that the temple was never primarily about the past, but rather was always fundamentally about the future, about our present moment, when the cosmic cycles that ancient astronomers tracked so carefully would complete their rotation and bring back whatever departed when the temple was buried beneath protective earth. The deliberate burial that once seemed like abandonment or destruction now appears as preservation, as protection, as the actions of people who understood that their most important message needed to survive through whatever catastrophes the turning ages might bring, who trusted that eventually humans would develop archaeological methods careful enough to excavate without destroying, scientific knowledge sufficient to recognize astronomical alignments and symbolic encoding, and perhaps most importantly, wisdom enough to take seriously the warnings carved by hands that shaped stone before agriculture transformed human existence from nomadic hunting to settled farming. What if we are what Göbekli Tepe was waiting for? Not in the sense that we're specially chosen or uniquely important, but simply in the sense that we happen to be the generation alive when the mathematical cycles that govern cosmic returns complete their rotation, when whatever departed promises to come back, when the warnings encoded in stone become urgently relevant rather than merely historically interesting. The message that Göbekli Tepe ultimately conveys might have less to do with literal beings returning from the sky and more to do with humanity's return to wisdom, to connection with cosmic patterns that our technology-obsessed civilization has forgotten in our rush to dominate nature, rather than understanding our participation in natural and cosmic cycles that operate at scales dwarfing human lifespans, or even the entire span of recorded history. We've achieved remarkable technological capabilities, while simultaneously losing knowledge that our ancestors considered fundamental. We can split atoms and sequence genomes, but most modern humans cannot navigate by stars, cannot predict weather patterns through observation of natural signs, cannot identify edible plants growing in their own bioregions, cannot build shelters using only natural materials found locally, and cannot survive for extended periods without the massive infrastructure of industrial civilization that provides our food, water, shelter, and energy through systems so complex and fragile that their failure would leave the vast majority of modern humans helpless in ways that our supposedly primitive ancestors never experienced. Perhaps the return that matters most isn't the arrival of external saviors or evaluators, but rather humanity's own return to understanding our embeddedness in larger systems, our recognition that consciousness and intelligence take forms vastly different from, and perhaps vastly superior to, the narrow technological rationality that we've privileged over other ways of knowing and being in the world. Yet, even as we acknowledge these more philosophical and metaphorical interpretations of what ancient warnings and return prophecies might mean for contemporary humanity, we cannot entirely dismiss the possibility that something more literal approaches, that the beings described so consistently across ancient cultures did indeed exist and do indeed follow cyclical patterns of engagement with humanity tied to astronomical configurations or developmental thresholds or cosmic schedules operating according to logics we've barely begun to comprehend. The UAP phenomena that governments now acknowledge, the genetic anomalies that frustrate attempts to explain human evolution through purely gradualist Darwinian frameworks, the archaeological impossibilities like Göbekli Tepe that force us to reconsider what we know about our own history, the recurring accounts across all ancient cultures of beings from the sky who taught and then departed with promises to return. All these elements comprise a puzzle that our current paradigms struggle to solve, suggesting that something fundamental about our understanding of reality, consciousness, intelligence, and humanity's place in cosmic history requires revision before we can adequately comprehend what our ancestors were trying to tell us, and what might be approaching. As astronomical cycles complete rotations that began before pyramids rose and before Sumerian scribes pressed the first written words into clay tablets that still speak to us across 4,000 years of accumulated human experience. The choice that faces our generation, standing at this peculiar intersection of technological capability and existential threat, of official UAP disclosure and ancient mystery obsession, of artificial intelligence emergence and ecological collapse, involves deciding whether we will preserve knowledge for those who come after us, or whether we will allow our accumulated wisdom to vanish as thoroughly as pre-Younger Dryas civilizations vanished, when cosmic catastrophe struck and scattered the survivors too thinly across devastated landscapes to maintain the libraries and universities and specialized knowledge that advanced societies require. If we face approaching catastrophe, whether through climate change, nuclear war, artificial intelligence escaping human control, or cosmic impacts like the one that may have inspired Göbekli Tepe's construction, then what knowledge do we preserve? How do we encode it to survive whatever destroys our current civilization? And what warnings do we leave for whoever eventually excavates our ruins and wonders what happened to the people who built skyscrapers and satellites and supercomputers, but apparently couldn't prevent their own collapse? The builders of Göbekli Tepe chose stone pillars and symbolic encoding, media that have indeed survived 10,000 years of war, climate change, and cultural transformation. And perhaps we should consider whether our digital archives and paper libraries will prove as durable, or whether future archaeologists will find our technological marvels as incomprehensible as we initially found Göbekli Tepe before decades of study began revealing its secrets. The final image that stays with us as we conclude this exploration is both ancient and immediate, both mysterious and familiar. A modern human stands before Göbekli Tepe's pillars at sunrise, watching the same sun that illuminated Stone Age carvers working 12,000 years earlier. And in that moment, the vast gulf of time collapses into recognition. That we face the same fundamental questions that have haunted human consciousness since our species first looked up at the stars and wondered what lies beyond the visible. What intelligence might dwell in the cosmic void? What patterns govern the rise and fall of civilizations? And whether we're alone in the universe, or whether others watch our stumbling progress toward either transcendence or extinction, with the patient attention that parents give children learning to walk. The questions remain the same across millennia. Where do we come from? Why are we here? Where are we going? And are there others who know answers we're still struggling to formulate? But perhaps now, in our present moment, as technology accelerates toward singularity and as official acknowledgement of UAPs cracks open doors that establishment science kept firmly closed, we're finally developing the capability to receive answers that ancient peoples encoded in stone, because they understood that someday, if humanity survived long enough and developed sufficient wisdom, we would need to know what they had witnessed, what they had survived, what they had been taught by beings who came from somewhere else, bringing knowledge and technology that transformed human existence. And most importantly, what signs to watch for that would herald the return of those beings when cosmic cycles completed their rotation and the age changed, and whatever departed came back to see what we had learned during their absence. Whether the Anunnaki are literal extraterrestrials following orbital mechanics, we've yet to fully map. Metaphorical representations of human potential waiting to be actualized. Surviving remnants of pre-catastrophe civilizations maintaining themselves hidden while surface societies rise and fall. Or something stranger that our current categories cannot capture. The fundamental question posed by Göbekli Tepe remains urgently relevant as we navigate the treacherous waters of the 21st century, with its simultaneous promise of technological transcendence and threat of civilizational collapse. When the cycle turns, when the return happens, whether through arrival of external intelligences or through humanity's own awakening to cosmic patterns we've ignored during our adolescence as a species, will we be ready to receive the knowledge that ancient builders preserved for this moment? Will we have developed sufficient wisdom to use that knowledge for flourishing rather than destruction? And will we prove ourselves worthy inheritors of the legacy that hands turned to dust 10,000 years ago, carved into stone and buried in earth, so that we, their distant descendants, standing before those same stones with technologies they couldn't imagine, but facing questions they knew intimately, might have the warnings and the wisdom necessary to survive whatever comes next in the eternal turning of ages that has governed human destiny since before memory, and will continue long after our current concerns have themselves become mysterious symbols that future archaeologists excavate from ruins we cannot yet imagine becoming.